Across the fence, art, collecting, and philanthropy. We'll visit a private collection of Vermont art to find out how it was put together and what's going to happen to it in the future. Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. In 2016, the University of Vermont's Fleming Museum featured art from the collections of more than 20 UVM alumni. Some of those pieces were from the collection of Brooks Buxton. He's a Vermont native from the class of 1956. The Fleming will one day be the permanent home of the Buxton collection. We spoke with Museum Director Janie Cohen about the gift and how it reaches beyond the university.
I really think this is by far one of the most important gifts ever given, in the history, not just of the Fleming, but in the history of the university's collecting, which began in 1827. This collection really represents a document of the changing Vermont landscape, which is something that's studied, in the geology department, the geography department, in sociology, anthropology, throughout the university. So it's such an important gift on so many levels. The collection is kind of a double document of how art advanced during the course of the 20th century, but also of exactly how the landscape and the built landscape and the agricultural landscape and the use of the landscape advanced. So the information that they contain is so rich for a university collection beyond aesthetics.
To see more of Buxton's collection, we turn to Vermont historian and fellow collector Howard Coffin. Here's Howard.
I love art museums and art galleries. I haunt them. Sometimes I buy. I'm a collector. What I like most is to be surprised, to walk into a gallery and see something I never expected. Like in the Smith College Gallery recently, I saw this magnificent red Kandinsky landscape. It stayed in my mind. And here I am in a home in Jericho, Vermont, which contains surely the best private collection of Vermont art that exists. And I'm always looking for Vermont art. And when I went around this corner, boy, did I get surprised. Discovering art, it's everywhere in this house, the bedrooms, the bathrooms. And then on this wall, a wall covered with the work of Charles Heide, the 19th century Vermont landscape painter. There's a view of Mansfield, another one in winter, Burlington Harbor, Winooski Gorge. I'd seen pictures of these great pictures, but never the real thing until I came here. And then I had one of those Mussorgsky moments when the music soars for a discovery of art in the next room. The favorite painting that I came on is this Aldro Hibbard painting of a Vermont hill farm. My grandfather had one, and I look at this painting and I see that way of life as I think I have never seen it depicted. And the owner of this and the other paintings is Brooks Buxton. Thank you for having us in your home today.
Well, thank you. Glad you're here in the house in Jericho, and also that you have selected one of my favorite paintings as well. I grew up also, perhaps a whisker before you, but this is the essence of Vermont hillside farms, which existed, I would suppose, well into the 1940s after the Second World War.
I know one thing we have in common. I believe that you are a seventh generation Vermonter.
Yes, that's correct.
And you grew up?
Well, I grew up mainly in Jericho, but the family, my father's family, were from Plainfield, Marshfield, Hollister Hill,
Oh, yes.
the Buxton farm, and mother's family were from Montpelier.
And they collected a bit?
Yes, they did, and my grandmother did, and my great-grandmother collected also way back early in 1900, 1910, that era. They were aware of Vermont, particularly Vermont furniture, they were well aware of.
And you've had an interesting life. You went to the University of Vermont class of
6.
1956, yes. and then on to law school?
No, I went to, it was in the Air Force for 3 years.
Okay,
I was
yes.
in Air Force ROTC, so I was a young Air Force officer and stationed, of course, in the United States, but also in Spain for a year at the Strategic Air Command. That was the era when, of course, the Russians were coming.
Yes.
And so I had the good fortune of being in air base outside of Madrid for a year.
And you become an expatriate, I believe. You're overseas most of the time.
Yes, I was very fortunate. Again, it was the end of an era. I was overseas for nearly, well, over a period of 41 years, 42, basically in the Middle East and North Africa. And then the last few years I was in London for many years. Then I retired. I was in Saudi Arabia in Riyadh when I retired in 2003.
And you were in the oil business. Is that
Yes,
right?
that's
Yes.
correct. You know.
But you always stay in touch with Vermont.
Yes, of course, the family, extended family too, were here, but my roots were very strong. Again, I think a family tradition, and yes, I very much return faithfully on my vacations to Vermont, and remained a keen interest in the university, in other institutions in Vermont as well, of course. The legacy of being a Vermonter, but also of collecting Vermont furniture and Vermont paintings that would be someday would go to an institution in Vermont.
And in a recent conversation we had, you gave me some information on your modus operandi here about staying in touch with important people in the right places.
Well, yes, of course. I think that's essential with any collector, whether it's, again, antiques, books, paintings,
Yes.
baseball ephemera. You have to, I think, develop a core of reliable dealers, both here. Oddly enough, as we discussed when you were last here, Howard, many of the paintings which you find here, particularly the non-Vermont indigenous painters who came up from New York or the Boston area, they were carried through the years by major New York dealers, and Boston particularly as well. They might have sold these paintings when they were originally painted, let's say in the 1920s and 30s, of a New York artist. And then the family of the generations down don't wish to have them anymore, and they call the dealer, where their perhaps father or grandfather may have purchased this paint, like a Hibbard, for instance, who's carried still today his estate by the Vose Gallery on Newbury Street there in Boston.
You also mentioned, I think, staying in touch with the major auction houses in New York.
Yes, that's correct.
Sotheby's, Christie's.
And Christie's, and
Yes.
Skinner's in Boston, Northeast Auctions in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and of course here in Vermont, the Merrills have been, over the years, Dwayne Merrill, but his parents have been extremely supportive of my efforts, as Dwayne has, and his son Ethan now is carrying on that tradition of alerting me to potential good Vermont. My standards are pretty high, as you can notice.
As I can see, as I
yes.
can well see.
And so they've also learned, I think, through the years, to something exceptional turns up to let me know.
I found it fascinating, of course, having grown up in Woodstock with artists everywhere and summer people everywhere, that you make note that many of the paintings you have were the possessions of summer people in Vermont who would winter in New York or Washington or Boston, and the paintings would go with them, and that's how they turn up in the New York and Boston gallery.
That's correct, and which is a trail, you might say, but in a way it's a very fortunate one that these paintings do resurface, if you will, generation after generation, and then I'm able to see them and then decide whether they work with the collection, which in many cases they do, particularly if it's the same artist. There's naturally an understanding, a feel, like as you mentioned, Howard, very perceptively, this Aldro Hibbard, a Massachusetts, a Cambridge, a Boston, actually Gloucester, Cape May painter, but came up to Vermont. This is Townsend, Vermont. in 1938. And it's a very emotive, a very powerful image of, as you mentioned again, it realistically captures what you saw when you grew up in Vermont many years ago.
Your support of institutions here in Vermont has been widespread. I'm on the curatorial committee, the State House with you. I know you've supported the Shelburne Museum, been on their board. But the Fleming Museum at the University of Vermont, am I correct in assuming that this collection eventually goes there?
Yes, that is correct, and had always a keen interest with the Fleming. My school days in Jericho Elementary School, going down to visits to the Fleming, and then of course when I was at the university I took a keen interest and have over the years since. And I've been on the board of the Fleming for many, many years. Currently I'm chair, which I'm honored to still be able to contribute and to not only in the future gift of all the paintings here in the collection will go to the Fleming, which I think is extremely important as the university still has an agricultural college. Of course, it's very strong in the environment. And then even this Hibbert painting, but others in the house particularly point out the history, if you will, of Vermont agriculture, the landscape, the environmental changes, there's a pictorial record, an accurate record. Because many of these, particularly 19th century artists, they were trained as, some of them as surveyors. They, besides just their artistic talents, they had a feel for the land, for the openness, for the pastures, for the meadows, which is very helpful for us today, for students particularly, to study the history.
To see what we've lost.
Absolutely, to see what we have lost.
These more
Yeah.
open landscapes,
That's right.
this beauty that so much of it is gone. Speaking of beauty, you look out the front window of this house of yours and you see a very historic view. You see two bends of the Winooski River, that wonderful railroad bridge, but we're looking across the river at an historic site, are we not?
Oh, absolutely. I refer to it sort of in jest or in fun that I'm looking at Vermont's Mount Vernon. It's the home, of course, of Thomas Chittenden and his family, many of whom, and there are other, of course, Chittenden houses in Williston, but here the Clark family has kept the property. Amazing, these marvelous river bottom meadows, and of course the whole hillside of French Hill. And so I feel very privileged to be looking out on the farm of our founding father, of Thomas Chittenden.
Talk to me about some of your favorite pieces in the collection, Brooks.
Well, it's odd that I do have some. Charles Louis Heide came up here from New York. He'd studied under Thomas Cole. Of course, never had that distinction of being Thomas, but he somehow, in an honest way, he focused, of course, on Lake Champlain, Mount Mansfield, and of course the High Bridge there in Winooski, kind of his three subject matters. But yet they're honest paintings, and I very much captured, say, mid-19th century Vermont. He was not as sophisticated, say, as an example, as a Hibbert or a Paul Sample, John Carlson, the New Yorkers who came up. And again, I think what I tried to do in collecting is that to select a painter who understood what life was about. These are not romanticized. These are really, they had a feeling, they had an understanding of how simple 19th century and the early 20th century Vermont farmers were, their lifestyle. And I think they were able to pick up on this, as a good writer has done the same. I sort of chuckle sometimes when I read or reread Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton. Of course, she was a sophisticated gal, but yet she picked up the essence of this hard scrabble incident on a Vermont farm. And I think these painters did the same. that they had a special understanding for the environment, for the openness, for the ruggedness, for the difficulty, if you will, the hard, it was a hard life.
Well, thank you, Brooks, for a job well done and still being done. And thank you all for watching Across the Fence. I'm Howard Coffin.